An empath does not leave loudly. They do not slam doors or announce their exit. They fade. They withdraw. They grow quiet. And one day you realize they are gone, not because they stopped caring, but because caring began to cost them their health, their peace, and their sense of self. Empaths are not born fragile. They are shaped by environments where attunement was missing, where love was conditional, where being sensitive was not safe. They learned early to scan emotional climates, to anticipate needs, to soften their presence so others could feel comfortable. This is not weakness. This is adaptation. But here is the truth most people miss. An empath, as great as strength, emotional attunement becomes their deepest wound when it is exploited. Do this to an empath, and they will disappear from your life. Make them feel unseen. You can listen to their words and still not hear them. You can benefit from their care while dismissing their pain. You can rely on their understanding while refusing to understand them in return. And every time you do, something inside them learns the connection requires self-erasure. Empaths stay longer than they should. They give more chances than are deserved. They explain their pain gently, hoping clarity will create change. But what truly wounds them is not conflict, it is indifference. When an empath feels that their emotions are inconvenient, excessive, or irrelevant, their nervous system receives a clear message: you are not safe here. And the body never argues with that truth. Another way to make an empath disappear is to cross their boundaries repeatedly, while calling it love. Empaths are often taught that boundaries equal rejection, that saying no risks abandonment. So they tolerate what hurts them, convincing themselves that endurance is loyalty. But boundaries are not walls. They are the conditions under which love can exist without self-betrayal. When you ignore an empath as limits, when you demand access to their time, energy, and emotional labor without consent, you teach them that closeness means depletion. And eventually, the body refuses to participate in relationships that feel like slow emotional starvation. Do this long enough, and the empath will stop explaining. Not because they have nothing to say, but because they have learned it makes no difference. Another way to lose an empath forever is to take their empathy for granted. Empaths do not give because they are naive. They give because they feel. They sense pain before it is spoken. They hold space instinctively. But when their generosity becomes expected rather than appreciated, it turns into a quiet form of exploitation. Being endlessly understanding without being understood back is exhausting. Being emotionally available to people who are unavailable in return teaches the empath that intimacy is one-sided, and the nervous system keeps score. At some point, the empath reaches a moment of clarity that looks like withdrawal from the outside, but feels like awakening on the inside. They realize they are tired not because they love too much, but because they have been loving alone. This is where disappearance begins, not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of self-preservation. When an empath leaves, it is often after they have grieved the relationship while still inside it. They mourn what could have been. They release hope quietly. By the time they go, they are already emotionally gone. And here's what surprises people most. Once an empath truly leaves, they rarely return. Because the leaving was not impulsive. It was the final act of choosing themselves after years of self-abandonment. If you want to keep an empath in your life, the answer is not control. It is presence. It is respect. It is emotional reciprocity. See them. Listen when they speak softly, because that is when they are being most honest. Honor their boundaries before they are forced to defend them. Meet their depth with your own rather than asking them to shrink. Empaths do not disappear when they are loved well. They disappear when love demands their silence. And if they have already vanished from your life, understand this. They did not leave because they stopped caring. They left because they finally started. Empaths survive by feeling because feeling is how they learn to stay connected, oriented, and alive in the world. From early on, sensitivity became their compass. They learned to read tone before words, energy before expression, silence before explanation. Feeling was not a luxury for them, it was a survival skill. It allowed them to anticipate danger, soothe tension, and maintain attachment in environments where emotional safety was uncertain or inconsistent. Their nervous systems adapted to prioritize connection, because connection once meant safety, belonging, and sometimes even survival itself. For an empath, feeling is not something that can be switched off at will. It lives in the body, in the gut, in the chest, in the subtle shifts of breath and muscle. Feeling is how they recognize truth. It is how they know when something is wrong long before logic can catch up. This depth of perception gives them a remarkable capacity for compassion, understanding, and presence. They can sit with pain without turning away. They can hold complexity without needing simple answers. They can see the wounded child behind the defensive adult and respond with gentleness instead of judgment. But the same sensitivity that allows an empath to survive can also become the place where they are most deeply wounded. When feeling is met with dismissal, ridicule, or exploitation, the empath's nervous system begins to associate emotional openness with danger. When their pain is minimized, when their needs are labeled as too much, when their intuition is questioned or ignored, a subtle but profound shift occurs inside them. Feeling, which once kept them safe, starts to feel like a liability. Unsafe feeling does not always come from obvious harm. It often comes from repeated small moments of emotional neglect, being interrupted when sharing something vulnerable, being told to calm down instead of being understood, being relied upon for support while receiving none in return, being praised for strength while never being allowed to be weak. Over time, these moments accumulate in the body as tension, fatigue, and quiet resentment. The empath may not consciously register each wound, but their nervous system does. When feeling becomes unsafe, the empath does not immediately leave. More often, they try harder, they explain themselves more carefully, they soften their language, they lower their expectations. They convince themselves that if they can just communicate better, love more patiently, or understand more deeply, the relationship will finally feel mutual. This persistence is often mistaken for limitless capacity, but it is actually a sign of how deeply the empath fears disconnection. The real cost emerges slowly. The empath begins to feel drained after interactions that once nourished them. Their body tightens in anticipation of conversations. Their enthusiasm dims. They start second-guessing their perceptions, wondering if they are too sensitive, too emotional, too demanding. This self-doubt is not a personal flaw. It is the consequence of being in environments where their inner experience is repeatedly invalidated. The empath learns, often unconsciously, that staying connected requires self-silencing. Disappearing does not begin with leaving. It begins with withdrawal from the self. The empath stops sharing their inner world. They offer surface-level responses instead of truth. They keep their insights to themselves. They emotionally brace before interactions. To others, they may appear calm, composed, even distant. Inside, they are protecting what little safety they have left. The nervous system is doing what it was designed to do, reduce exposure to perceived threat. At some point, the empath recognizes that their body no longer feels at home in the relationship. This recognition is not dramatic. It is quiet and embodied. A sense of heaviness when thinking about the other person, a feeling of relief when there is distance, a subtle grief for what was hoped for but never received. The empath begins to realize that love without safety is not love, it is endurance. Disappearing is not an act of punishment. It is not a strategy to make someone miss them. It is the final stage of self-protection, when all other strategies have failed. When the empath disappears, they are choosing regulation over chaos, integrity over attachment, health over familiarity. They are responding to a biological truth. The body cannot heal in the same environment that keeps wounding it. What many people misunderstand is that the empath, as disappearance, is often preceded by years of trying. By the time they step back, they have already mourned the relationship eternally. They have felt the sadness, the disappointment, the longing for mutuality. Their leaving looks sudden only to those who were not paying attention to the quieter signals along the way. Feeling becomes safe for an empath only when it is met with presence rather than defensiveness, curiosity rather than correction, care rather than control. Safety is created when emotions are allowed to exist without being fixed or dismissed, when boundaries are respected without being taken personally, when empathy flows in both directions. Without these conditions, the empath's sensitivity has nowhere to rest. So they retreat, not because they are fragile, but because they are finally listening to their body. Disappearing is the moment when survival through feeling gives way to survival through distance. It is the nervous system saying no more. We cannot keep opening where there is no shelter. We cannot keep offering depth where there is no ground to receive it. We cannot keep explaining our pain to people who benefit from not understanding it. We cannot keep choosing connection at the cost of our own aliveness. We cannot keep feeling in places that have proven again and again that feeling is not safe. Chronic emotional neglect rarely announces itself as neglect. It does not always come with cruelty, shouting, or obvious rejection. More often, it is defined by absence, the absence of attunement, the absence of curiosity about a child's inner world, the absence of someone who notices emotional shifts and responds with care. For the empath, this absence becomes formative. They grow up learning not that their feelings are wrong, but that their feelings do not matter enough to be met. This lesson settles quietly into the body and shapes the way they relate to themselves and others. An empath raised in emotional neglect learns early that connection is unpredictable. Sometimes there is warmth, sometimes distance, and no clear explanation for either. This inconsistency trains the nervous system to stay alert. The child becomes vigilant, scanning faces, tones, and moods to determine what is safe to express and what must be hidden. Emotional intelligence develops not from support, but from necessity. Sensitivity becomes a way to maintain attachment in an environment where emotional presence is unreliable. Because their feelings were not mirrored, the empath does not learn how to recognize and prioritize their own needs. Instead, they learn to prioritize the needs of others. They become skilled at anticipating, accommodating, and adapting. This adaptation is often rewarded. They are praised for being mature, understanding, easy, helpful. What goes unseen is the cost. The child learns that love flows toward compliance, and so they begin to organize themselves around being acceptable rather than authentic. Self-abandonment does not start as a choice. It starts as a survival strategy. When a child's emotions are consistently unmet, expressing them feels futile or even dangerous. The body learns to suppress signals of hunger, sadness, anger, or fear in order to preserve connection. Over time, this suppression becomes internalized. The empath no longer needs an external figure to ignore their feelings. They do it automatically. They dismiss their own discomfort, rationalize their pain, and override their intuition. As adults, empaths shaped by chronic emotional neglect often appear deeply compassionate, capable, and resilient. They hold space for others with remarkable patience. They listen without judgment. They sense what is unspoken. Yet internally, they may feel empty, disconnected, or chronically exhausted. They may struggle to answer simple questions like, what do you need or what do you want? Their attention has been trained outward for so long that turning inward feels unfamiliar and uncomfortable. Emotional neglect teaches the empath that their worth is relational rather than inherent. They learn to measure their value by how useful, understanding, or supportive they are. Love becomes something to earn rather than something to receive. This belief drives them into relationships where they overgive, overfunction, and overextend. They tolerate imbalance because it feels familiar. Being needed feels safer than being known. In these dynamics, the empath often confuses endurance with love. They stay in situations that deplete them because leaving triggers old fears of abandonment. Their nervous system equates separation with danger, even when staying is harmful. They minimize their pain, telling themselves others have it worse, or that they are being too sensitive. This internal gaslighting is a direct echo of early emotional neglect. The empath continues the pattern of not being there for themselves. Self-abandonment also shows up as difficulty setting boundaries. Saying no feels like a threat to connection. Expressing limits brings guilt and anxiety. The empath may intellectually understand the importance of boundaries, yet feel physically distressed when attempting to enforce them. This is not weakness. It is the body remembering that in the past, asserting needs did not lead to care, but to distance or withdrawal. Over time, the cost of self-abandonment accumulates in the body. Chronic tension, fatigue, anxiety, and vague health issues often emerge. The empath may feel disconnected from joy and spontaneity. Life becomes about managing others' emotions rather than inhabiting their own. They may function well externally while feeling internally numb or overwhelmed. The body carries what the mind has learned to ignore. Healing begins when the empath recognizes that their patterns are not character flaws, but adaptations to emotional neglect. There is nothing wrong with their sensitivity. The problem was never that they felt too much, but that there was no one consistently there to meet what they felt. This recognition allows compassion to replace self-judgment. It opens the possibility of a different relationship with the self. Reclaiming the self means learning to stay present with one's own emotions without immediately dismissing or fixing them. It means noticing discomfort and responding with curiosity instead of override. It means practicing boundaries as acts of self-respect rather than rejection. This process can feel destabilizing at first because it challenges deeply ingrained survival strategies. Yet over time, it restores a sense of internal safety that was missing. When the empath stops abandoning themselves, relationships begin to change. Some connections deepen because they are built on mutual presence rather than sacrifice. Others fall away because they depended on the empath, self-erasure. This loss can be painful, but it is also clarifying. It reveals which relationships are capable of holding the empath as a whole person. Chronic emotional neglect teaches the empath to disappear from themselves in order to stay connected. Healing teaches them that true connection does not require disappearance. It requires presence, honesty, and the courage to matter to oneself. The empath's task is not to feel less, but to create enough internal safety that feeling no longer threatens abandonment. Where sensitivity becomes a source of vitality, rather than a reason to leave oneself behind, taking empathy without reciprocity creates a form of exhaustion that is rarely named and almost never validated. It is not the loud burnout that comes from overwork or visible stress. It is quieter, subtler, and more corrosive. It accumulates in the nervous system of the empath through repeated moments of giving emotional presence without receiving it in return. Each interaction may seem small and manageable on its own, but together they create a persistent drain that slowly erodes vitality, clarity, and self-trust. Empathy is not an infinite resource. It is a relational exchange that requires attunement on both sides to remain nourishing. For the empath, offering empathy is natural and often automatic. They sense emotional shifts, register discomfort, and respond with care without being asked. This responsiveness is frequently interpreted by others as strength or generosity, but when it is taken without awareness or return, it becomes a form of extraction. The empath gives presence, validation, and emotional labor, while their own inner world remains unattended. Invisible exhaustion develops when the empath's capacity to hold space is relied upon rather than respected. They become the listener, the stabilizer, the one who understands. Others vent, process, unload, and regulate through them. The empath absorbs tone, mood, and unspoken distress, often without realizing how much is being taken. Because empathy flows outward, so naturally they may not notice the imbalance until their body begins to signal distress. One of the most damaging aspects of unreciprocated empathy is how normal it feels to the empath. Many have been conditioned from early life to attend to others as a way of maintaining connection. They learned that being emotionally available was a requirement for belonging. As a result, one-sided emotional dynamics feel familiar, even comforting at first. The empath may interpret their fatigue as a personal failure rather than a relational issue. The exhaustion is invisible because it is not acknowledged by the environment. The empath may still be praised for being supportive, kind, and strong. From the outside, they appear composed and capable. Inside, they feel drained, irritable, or numb. They may struggle to concentrate, lose motivation, or feel a persistent heaviness that does not lift with rest. This is not because they are giving too much in general, but because they are giving into relationships where there is no return flow. Reciprocity does not mean equal words or identical expressions of care. It means emotional presence moving in both directions. It means being curious about the empath's experience, noticing when they are tired, asking how they are doing, and genuinely listening to the answer. When this does not happen, the empath's nervous system begins to associate connection with depletion. Over time, even positive interactions can feel taxing because the body anticipates one-sided giving. Unreciprocated empathy also erodes self-trust. The empath may sense that something is wrong but struggle to name it. They may feel guilty for wanting more, believing that needing support makes them selfish or weak. This internal conflict deepens exhaustion because the empath expends energy suppressing their own needs while continuing to meet others. The body carries the tension of this contradiction. As exhaustion grows, the empath may attempt to cope by withdrawing emotionally while remaining physically present. They offer less depth, shorter responses, less engagement. This can be misinterpreted as disinterest or moodiness by others who have grown accustomed to the empath as full availability. The empath may then feel pressure to return to their previous level of giving, reinforcing the cycle of depletion. Eventually, the body demands change. The empath may experience anxiety, depressive symptoms, or a sense of emptiness that cannot be explained by external circumstances. These are not signs of fragility. They are signals from a nervous system that has been carrying too much without support. The body is communicating that empathy without reciprocity is unsustainable. What makes this exhaustion particularly painful is that it often occurs in relationships that the empath values deeply. They may love the people who drain them. They may understand the reasons behind others' limitations. This understanding keeps them in the dynamic longer, hoping that care will eventually be returned. The understanding does not replace reciprocity. Compassion does not eliminate the need to be met. Healing begins when the empath recognizes that reciprocity is not a demand, but a condition for healthy connection. It requires learning to notice how interactions feel in the body. It involves allowing oneself to receive, not just give. It means setting limits on emotional labor without justification or apology. This can feel uncomfortable because it challenges long-held beliefs about worth and belonging. When the empath starts to value reciprocity, some relationships shift, others fade. This is not a loss of empathy, but a refinement of it. Empathy becomes grounded rather than draining. It flows where there is mutual presence and stops where there is chronic extraction. The empath learns that caring for others does not require abandoning themselves. Invisible exhaustion lifts when empathy is met with empathy, when listening is shared, when care is mutual. In these conditions, sensitivity becomes a source of connection rather than depletion. The empath does not need to harden or withdraw to survive. They can remain open without being emptied, present without being consumed, and deeply caring without disappearing into the emotional needs of others. An empath will stay far longer than is healthy, not because they lack awareness, but because their nervous system is organized around connection. Leaving does not feel like relief at first, it feels like threat. The empath senses emotional undercurrents, sees potential, remembers moments of closeness, and holds on to the hope that understanding and patience will eventually create safety. They stay because they feel, and because feeling has always been tied to survival. From early life, many empaths learned that relationships required endurance. Love was something maintained through attunement, tolerance, and self-sacrifice. They became skilled at reading others while ignoring themselves. When discomfort arises in adult relationships, this old conditioning activates. The empath interprets pain as something to work through rather than something to listen to. They believe that if they can just stay present, communicate better, or give more compassion, the situation will shift. Staying longer than is healthy often looks like loyalty from the outside. The empath is patient, forgiving, and willing to see the other person as wounds. They explain behavior instead of confronting it. They minimize harm by focusing on intent rather than impact. This generosity of perception keeps them anchored in situations that slowly erode their well-being. The empath does not stay because they are unaware of the cost, but because they have learned to tolerate cost as the price of belonging. The body, however, does not share the mind as optimism. Long before the empath consciously considers leaving, their nervous system begins to register strain. Subtle signals appear. A tightening in the chest before certain conversation, a drop in energy after interactions, difficulty relaxing even in moments of calm. These signals are often dismissed. The empath tells themselves they are tired, stressed, or overreacting. They override the body in favor of preserving connection. As time passes, the empath's inner world narrows. Joy becomes harder to access. Curiosity fades. The relationship consumes emotional bandwidth that was once available for creativity, play, and rest. The empath may still function outwardly, meeting responsibilities and offering support, but internally they feel worn down. This depletion is not dramatic. It is gradual, like water wearing away stone. One of the reasons empaths stay so long is their capacity for understanding. They see the other person's pain, history, and limitations. This insight fosters compassion, but it can also become a trap. Understanding becomes justification. The empath reasons that if behavior is rooted in trauma, it should be tolerated. But trauma explains behavior. It does not excuse harm. When empathy flows in only one direction, it creates imbalance that the nervous system cannot sustain. The breaking point does not arrive suddenly. It builds quietly beneath the surface. The empath may experience increasing anxiety, sadness, or numbness. Sleep may become disrupted. The body may hold chronic tension. These symptoms are often treated as individual problems, rather than relational signals. The empath continues to stay, hoping relief will come from within, rather than recognizing the environment itself is contributing to the distress. Eventually, something inside shifts. It may be triggered by a small incident that on its own seems insignificant. A dismissive comment, a broken promise, a moment of being unheard. What breaks is not patience, but illusion. The empath realizes, often with a deep sense of grief, that the relationship will not become what they hoped. This realization is embodied. It feels like a collapse of energy, a loss of motivation to keep trying. When the empath breaks, it does not look like rage or drama. More often, it looks like quiet withdrawal. They stop explaining. They stop chasing repair. The emotional effort that once fueled the relationship is no longer available. This is not a conscious punishment. It is the nervous system conserving what remains. The empath is no longer willing to sacrifice their internal stability for the possibility of change. Leaving after the break is often misunderstood. To others, it may seem sudden or cold. They may say the empath gave no warning. In reality, the warnings were present for a long time, expressed through fatigue, hesitation, and repeated attempts at communication. The empath stayed through discomfort, hoping presence would lead to mutuality. When they finally leave, it is because staying has become more dangerous than leaving. What truly breaks inside the empath is the belief that love requires self-erasure. The break is painful, but it is also liberating. It marks the moment when self-preservation overrides conditioning. The empath chooses their body, as truth over the story that endurance equals care. This choice is not easy. It often comes with guilt, sadness, and fear, yet it is also the beginning of returning to oneself. After the break, the empath may need time alone. This solitude is not withdrawal from the world, but a process of reorientation. They learn to listen to their body again, to trust discomfort as information, to honor limits without justification. Slowly, vitality returns. The empath rediscovers parts of themselves that were muted in service of staying. An empath stays far longer than is healthy, because leaving challenges deep survival patterns. They leave only when something inside finally breaks. Not because they are weak, but because they are done breaking themselves. The breaking point is not failure. It is the moment when the body and soul align and say enough. This cost is too high. This connection no longer supports life. And choosing oneself is no longer optional. Disrespect to boundaries feels like a threat to survival for the sensitive nervous system, because boundaries are not preferences for the empath. They are regulators of safety. For a sensitive system, boundaries determine whether connection can exist without overwhelm, whether closeness can be nourishing instead of destabilizing. When boundaries are ignored, dismissed, or challenged, the body does not interpret this as a simple disagreement. It experiences it as danger, as a signal that protection is required. A sensitive nervous system develops in environments where attunement was inconsistent or absent. Early on, the empath learned that their internal signals were not reliably respected. They may have been touched when they did not want to be touched, expected to perform emotionally when depleted, or required to prioritize others' needs over their own. Over time, the body adapted by becoming hyper-aware, scanning for cues of safety and threat. Boundaries became the only way to create containment in a world that felt intrusive. For such a system, a boundary is not about control, it is about regulation. It is how the body manages stimulation, emotion, and relational closeness. When someone pushes past a stated or implied boundary, the empath's nervous system reacts instantly. Muscles tighten, breath shortens, heart rate shifts. This happens even if the empath cannot immediately articulate what is wrong. The response is pre-verbal, rooted in survival memory rather than conscious thought. Disrespecting boundaries often shows up in subtle ways, repeatedly interrupting, insisting on access to time or attention, dismissing no as negotiable, minimizing discomfort, demanding explanations for limits. Each of these actions communicates the same message to the sensitive nervous system: your signals will not be honored here. The body registers this as a loss of agency, which is deeply destabilizing. Because empaths are often attuned to others, they may override their boundary responses at first. They rationalize. They explain. They soften their limits to avoid conflict. This is not because the boundary is weak, but because the nervous system is torn between two survival needs: protection and attachment. Early conditioning often taught the empath that asserting limits risks abandonment, so the body attempts to preserve connection even while feeling threatened. This internal conflict is exhausting. The empath may feel anxious without knowing why. They may feel guilty for needing space, rest, or clarity. Their body remains in a low-grade state of activation, preparing for intrusion. Over time, this chronic activation leads to fatigue, irritability, and emotional withdrawal. The nervous system is working overtime to maintain a sense of safety that the environment does not support. When boundary disrespect continues, the empath system escalates its response. What begins as discomfort can turn into shutdown or overwhelm. The empath may dissociate, numb out, or feel suddenly cold and distant. To others, this can look like moodiness or withdrawal. In reality, it is a protective response. The body is reducing engagement because engagement has become unsafe. For the sensitive nervous system, boundaries are also tied to identity. They define where the self ends and the other begins. When boundaries are violated, the empath may feel invaded, confused, or erased. This is especially true for those who grew up without clear emotional separateness. Without respected boundaries, the empath loses access to their own inner signals. They may struggle to know what they feel or want because their system is constantly adapting to external demands. Disrespect to boundaries can also trigger deep shame. The empath may internalize the violation, believing they are unreasonable or difficult for needing limits. This shame compounds the threat. Not only is the environment unsafe, but the self is judged for recognizing it. The nervous system becomes trapped, unable to assert or retreat without consequence. Safety for a sensitive system is created when boundaries are met with acceptance rather than resistance, when no is received without argument, when space is allowed without guilt, when limits are honored even if they are not fully understood. These responses tell the body that it can relax, that connection does not require vigilance. In such conditions, the empath can remain open without fear. When boundaries are respected, the nervous system downshifts, breath deepens, muscles soften, curiosity returns. The empath becomes more present, not less. This is often misunderstood. Some believe boundaries create distance, But for the sensitive nervous system, boundaries are what make closeness possible. They create a container in which intimacy can exist without threat. When boundaries are repeatedly disrespected, the empath may eventually choose distance over negotiation. This is not punishment. It is regulation. The nervous system selects the option that offers the greatest chance of stability. Leaving, withdrawing, or limiting contact becomes the only way to restore safety when internal limits are not honored externally. Understanding boundary sensitivity requires recognizing that not all nervous systems are wired the same. What feels minor to one person can feel overwhelming to another. This does not mean the empath is fragile. It means their system processes information deeply. It takes in tone, intention, and emotional charge. Boundaries help filter this input so it can be integrated rather than overwhelming. Healing for the empath involves learning to trust boundary signals without justification, to recognize that discomfort is information, not something to override, to understand that needing limits does not make them unloving. As they practice honoring their own boundaries, their nervous system gradually learns that protection does not always require withdrawal. It can exist within connection when the environment is responsive. Disrespect to boundaries feels like a threat to survival because it revives old patterns of powerlessness and intrusion. Respect restores agency, tells the sensitive nervous system that it is allowed to exist as it is, with its rhythms, limits, and depth. In that safety, the empath does not need to disappear, harden, or break. They can stay present, open, and alive without sacrificing themselves. When an empath leaves, it is not punishment. It is self-preservation. The leaving is rarely impulsive or dramatic. It is the result of a long internal process that unfolds quietly, often invisibly over time. Long before the empath physically steps away, the nervous system has been weighing the cost of staying. The decision to leave emerges not from anger or spite, but from exhaustion, grief, and the body's need for safety. Empaths are oriented toward connection. They sense emotional undercurrents and feel responsible for harmony. Because of this, leaving a relationship is often the last option they consider. They stay through confusion, disappointment, and pain, hoping understanding will restore balance. They try to communicate gently, to explain how something feels, rather than accuse. They give chances, then more chances, believing that care and patience will eventually be met. During this period, the empath is not passive. They are actively working to preserve the relationship. They adjust themselves, soften needs, and reinterpret hurtful moments in more generous ways. This effort is fueled by empathy, but it comes at a cost. Each time the empath suppresses discomfort to maintain connection, the body records that suppression. Over time, the nervous system begins to associate closeness with threat rather than nourishment. The turning point arrives when the body can no longer sustain this contradiction. Staying connected while feeling unsafe creates chronic activation. The empath may experience anxiety, fatigue, or emotional numbness. They may feel a growing sense of disorientation, as if they are losing access to themselves. These are not signs of weakness. They are survival signals indicating that the environment is no longer compatible with the empath's well-being. Leaving, in this context, is an act of regulation. It is the nervous system choosing stability over chaos. The empath does not leave to teach a lesson or provoke regret. In fact, many empaths struggle with guilt when they finally decide to step away. They worry about hurting the other person, even when they themselves have been hurting for a long time. This guilt is often rooted in early conditioning that equated self-assertion with harm. What outsiders often miss is how much grieving happens before the empath leaves. They grieve the potential of the relationship, the moments of closeness that once existed, and the version of themselves who kept hoping. By the time they go, much of the emotional attachment has already been processed internally. This is why their departure can seem sudden or cold. It is not that they do not feel. It is that they have already felt everything. Self-preservation also means reclaiming agency. In relationships where boundaries are not respected or empathy is not reciprocated, the empath's sense of self gradually erodes. Leaving restores a sense of authorship over one's life. It allows the empath to listen to their body again, to honor signals that were previously ignored. This return to self can feel unfamiliar at first, even lonely, but it brings relief. It is important to understand that self-preservation is not selfishness. It is the foundation of ethical care. An empath who stays, while depleted, cannot offer genuine presence. Their empathy becomes strained, resentful, or performative. By leaving, they prevent further harm to themselves and to the relationship. Distance becomes a form of honesty when closeness requires self-betrayal. After leaving, the empath often enters a period of recalibration. They may need solitude to recover from chronic emotional overstimulation. This withdrawal is not rejection of others, but an invitation back to themselves. They learn to feel their own emotions without managing someone else. At the same time, they begin to distinguish between compassion and self-sacrifice, between understanding and endurance. Some relationships cannot survive this shift. They were built on the empath as overextension. When that overextension ends, the structure collapses. This can be painful, but it is also revealing. It clarifies which connections were sustained by mutual presence and which depended on imbalance. The empath does not leave to punish, but they also do not return to dynamics that require disappearance. Self-preservation allows the empath to redefine intimacy. Safety becomes a prerequisite rather than a hope. Boundaries become non-negotiable. Empathy remains, but it is grounded in self-respect. The empath learns that love does not require them to tolerate ongoing harm, confusion, or neglect. They discover that care can exist without constant self-explanation or emotional labor. When an empath leaves, they are responding to a biological and emotional truth. The body cannot thrive in environments that repeatedly signal danger. Leaving is the moment when the empath chooses life over loyalty, health over familiarity, presence over persistence. It is not an act against another person. It is an act for themselves. This understanding changes how departure is interpreted. Instead of seeing it as abandonment or punishment, it can be recognized as a boundary enacted through action rather than words. The empath has reached the limit of what can be held without breaking. By leaving, they preserve what remains of their vitality and open the possibility for relationships that can meet them with the same depth they offer. Self-preservation is not the end of empathy. It is the return of empathy to its rightful place, rooted in safety, reciprocity, and respect. When the empath leaves, they are not withdrawing love from the world. They are protecting the part of themselves that makes love possible at all.